Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier. Today we'll talk about books that we received for review, including Competitive Ballroom Dancing, plus Community and Neighborhood Recovery at Ground Zero in New York. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
I'm glad to be here.
We'll start off with your book, because I thought this was interesting about competitive ballroom dancing.
Yeah. Well, we're looking at a book entitled Dance With Me, Ballroom Dancing and the Promise of Instant Intimacy by Julia Erickson, who, I'll find out where Julia works as a professor, sociology at Temple, and author of Kiss and Tell, Surveying Sex in the 20th Century and Taking Charge of Breast Cancer. Sociology, and this book is about the background system, the gender background system, I guess you'd call it, about creating intimacy, perceptions of both male and female dancers, and being a woman, being a man. I've noted that she made the point that there really is a real, I don't want to use the word separation, gender distinctions of the kind of male world, female world that she was sort of exploring through this, and also interviews with a lot of women who, their intimate relationships with, they've either, in one case, a woman had lost her husband, another case, the husband was not a dancer. In other words, their connections with men were for various reasons, not just partnerships and romantic relationships or things of that nature. But it touches on a lot of this.
And that seems to be a real key issue with this book, is the issue of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, both partners need to be familiar with each other and comfortable with each other and work together. But there's a way of doing it. They have to relax into their roles.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the dances, like the Roomba, are very, very sexual.
Mm-hmm.
But, and it shows if someone's too hesitant or too formulaic or too stiff, and yet there is a distinct pattern or a distinct area between the two participants, but that's something that women, it seemed as though in this book she was looking at how women had to become familiar with that, or comfortable with it, because they did have to do the dance steps. And the other thing that fascinated me about it, it's a real sport. I mean, if you watch that program Dancing with the Stars,
mm-hmm.
you can see that there's some serious injuries that people are getting. Back injuries and knee injuries,
sure.
And
right.
all that kind of stuff,
right.
When they're trying to do these really, over-the-top, glamorous kinds of dances. And one of the things that all the stars talk about is that it's real hard work. I mean, they're practicing 3-4 hours a
lot.
day.
Yeah, that's true. Well, of course, not only Dancing with the Stars, which is on the edge of competitive ballroom dancing, I guess, but the real competitive ballroom dancing is extremely on the level of professional competition and sport, heavy-duty exercise, a lot of practice, a lot of rehearsal. I mean, it's really very
and as people work up, and she talks about that, as they work up through the different layers to the top,
mm-hmm.
you start off with just, the informal kinds of instruction of just learning to do it, and then you start working through the different layers of competition. But when you get to the professional amateur thing, you're talking serious competitors.
Right.
And they have got to really get into shape and conditioning to be able to do that. And they have to be up for the performance regardless of whatever else might be going on.
Yeah, that's the performance level of this, Dance With Me, Ballroom Dancing and the Promise of Instant Intimacy. But then, of course, she does a whole series of interviews on the intimacy aspect, the connection that, how connections develop, I guess talking about the boundaries of connections between, but the aspect of companionship and having someone who you can kind of express. I mean, it's a great deal of trust to be working very closely with another dancer. there's that switch of who leads, who follows, how you trust, how you indicate as a follower, ways to improve the leading, or indicate to the person who's leading you that you can go now,
And some of
go
those
this way,
moves
go that way.
are really dangerous. I mean,
Yeah.
you really
A lot
have
of-
to know how you're doing it. And then
Yeah.
also when they're in these competitions, they often start with a whole bunch of couples dancing simultaneously. And even in that group, people need to know what they're going. If you're doing the fast step or something like that, you really have to know where you're going with that, because you can injure some other couple
Yeah.
if you're not careful.
Yeah, sure.
If you don't know what the routine is.
It's interesting how this she is looking at relatively formal dance world. I mean, there are lessons, there are events, there are times when you go for dancing, much as you would as a musician for orchestra rehearsal or something like that. But then what interests me is the kind of popular aspect of this. I'm thinking of something like the tango, in Latin America, which is actually all over the world now. These tango sessions with live music and people showing up, but it's in the realm of a less prescribed kind of dance event, much more popular. Although people still put a lot of energy into taking lessons and working things out with their partners and whatnot. It's kind of an interesting thing. I've always been thinking about this in terms of the difference between formal arts and popular arts. Dancing at a club, talk about bumping into couples. I mean, you're dancing where almost free expression is really part of the art, or the value that you're kind of looking at there. People can bump into each other a lot, but out of that come, I'm sure, some dancers who are just either better or more expressive or whatever. It's an interesting difference between the sort of the sociology of a world of practice and rehearsal and intentionality versus a world of let's go to the club, let's dance, and it's much more sort of open expression, see what happens.
When you add the edge of competition into it, it's an entirely different dimension to it.
Yeah.
Another thing that's fascinating to me was the role of coaches. I mean, everybody who's at the upper level has their coach, advising them what to do, and then it becomes also an issue of craft. In other words, you have your mentor who shows you, and she talked in that book about how this one guy who's really popular as a coach can only take on a certain number of people, because when he goes to a competition, he has to manage them all the way through all the different kinds of things they have to go through.
Right.
Because you have to be up for the competition and, deal with whatever issues may come up with, he thought that he could handle like 4 or 5 at a time.
Right.
And other people wondering how he could do that many.
Yeah, that's a lot to commit to, especially, I imagine, if you're students or whatever, you're athletes are competing with each other in some way. You may end up with your people are sort of struggling with each other, or competing.
She's got pictures in there, and I mean, these people are just in top shape.
Well, some of the poses are quite remarkable, because this is highly ornate ballroom dancing. It's not just, quote unquote, just the foxtrot, more like social dancing, and it's really elaborated out.
And they're, they get their ratings and they're judged and all that stuff. So I mean, it's very, very competitive.
So within that is this intimacy connection that she's looking at as well. It's kind of interesting how that goes together.
Sort of formalized kind of interaction with people that don't know each other before they go there. I mean,
Before
if you go to a dance studio for basic lessons, you may or may not know the person there at all.
Yeah, right.
Unless you have someone with you, and yet you're expected to dance these dances.
Sure. Well, I remember dance lessons as a kid, which was sort of something you had to you had to sort of put up with. But it was the whole purpose of that, of different age group, obviously.
Yeah.
Early teenagehood, and the whole purpose was to get kids to be used to being with each other, sort of pre-courtship. I mean, that whole thing about dance class was,
The social
how to
skills.
create some
Yeah.
kind of, however it might be, was it floundering? Awkward intimacy, I guess is what I would call it,
Social
being able
skills,
to,
yeah.
sure,
So
right,
they're how to interact
Right.
with people.
right.
And that is kind of interesting.
Especially
because-
members of the opposite sex, yeah.
And you normally would not be holding someone that close. This always fascinates
Yeah.
me about personal space. I mean, this is definitely within the realm of personal space. So
Oh, sure, the dance teachers would come up and push the girls and boys right together and say, "You're doing a foxtrot? What do you look like you're standing on a mountain yelling across a river. Get next to that girl." It was like funny. Yeah, I took
But when
dance
it's well
lessons from
done-
Mrs. Fox.
yeah, when it's well done, it really looks sharp.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, but you can always tell the couples that really have rehearsed
Yeah.
and understand how to do it.
I guess that's the intimacy thing strikes me with this book. The topic. And the difference between professional intentional dance, like the ballroom dance world, versus couples who grew up in a certain era and know how to dance well. I remember going to a wedding of a friend of mine. This was 30 years ago, and it was out. They lived outside New York, and his father and mother obviously had spent a lot of time dancing, and they grew up in an era when, in the 30s or 40s, when that was really the nature of dance events was, you knew those various dance steps. I mean, they glided across the dance floor. They obviously had you could tell how they cared for each other. It was just, I'll never forget it. It was remarkable, because usually people don't really know how to dance, and are kind of awkward, and we don't do that much in our society anymore, except maybe a certain age and a certain class, and they fit it, sort of middle class outside New York City, and had obviously grown up dancing and had spent a lot of time dancing. So,
And it's just nice to see someone do it well.
yeah, it wasn't like to my knowledge, I don't think they had spent years and years with professional dance coaching and stuff like that. They probably had dance lessons as kids, but then danced growing up and then through their lifetime. So they knew how to do it, It was kind of neat. And the same thing goes for popular music with, salsa or anything else. The dancers just, some have it together, and others, it's just not their thing. But it's not necessarily all this prescribed dance class and all that. It's kind of an interesting world. I think that's what attracts her as a sociologist, because there's this whole institutionalized world of what fits people together within that.
Well, plus the competition sets up standards for how you perform.
Yeah.
And so then it's
Yeah.
easier to rate people against those standards. How
Yeah.
are they performing? Are they comfortable with it?
It's curious what we do as human beings. It seems like we just build these structures, these formal structures to, whatever, pass, fail, good, bad, ratings, fitting within some kind of structural pattern that matches the various cultural values that you grow up with. I mean, something like this, I guess that's where the sociology comes in. Every group and every society across the world has something like this, where there's prescribed activity and rule-based behavior, and it's just kind of what humans do, I guess. I don't know.
Well, plus the questions she asks are about making sense and meaning of it. Why are
Yes,
people
right.
doing this? And some
Right.
of them have a deep need. Some of them are recovering from personal circumstances.
Well, yeah, this one woman who I was noting she interviewed she needed companionship. She had longed for, not only had her husband died, but companionship of different kinds. And I'm not saying pandering to you know, there was nothing, whatever, neurotic or anything about this. It was just like, okay, I have different, I express myself differently with different people, and but that's a contact need that a lot of people have.
Well, and to get people relaxed, she talks in there about how some of the coaches kind of flirt with the learners, you know, and it's regarded as just innocuous.
It's just part of
way to
the
help,
banter, that,
yeah.
right?
But it's
yeah.
helped. It's helped. They try to help people relax, and like this one woman who was really quite obese had a very bad opinion of herself, a very low self-esteem, and by this guy flirting with her a little bit, she relaxed and was able to do what, you know, the dance steps and stuff. Where before she was kind of standing off from it, you know, because she was uncertain of herself as a person.
But she was there just the same.
Yeah.
Something had gotten her through the door
Right.
to get to that point.
But by him flirting with her, it helped her feel a little more valued and part of the scene.
Yeah.
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 We'll shift a considerable amount here by talking about September 12, Community and Neighborhood Recovery Ground Zero by Gregory Smith-Simon, which is a pretty interesting book because, you know, we just celebrated the 10th anniversary. I don't know, celebrate is word, but observed.
Commemorated, yeah.
Yeah,
right, observed.
the 10th anniversary of the horrible situation on September 11, 2001. And this has to do with recovering of the people who lived in that area, in that local community. And I'm fascinated with this because there's been a lot of material written about the people and what they had gone through. But then the question comes, well, how can we recover? And the specific area he looked at was the Battery Park City, which is a neighborhood across the street from the World Trade Center, and how those people have begun rebuilding their lives, homes, and neighborhood of those who stayed. Now, not everyone stayed. And it was one of Manhattan's wealthiest neighborhoods in the heart of the financial district, and then all of a sudden became into the spotlight. And so he's looking at both the global forces that shape local landscapes and the exclusion that segregates American urban development. And so I found this pretty interesting to go through this. And in a way, you know, after you've had that kind of trauma, he talks about that, you know, every day seems like September 11th because you're living in the aftermath of something that happened so much, and particularly because they were near the epicenter of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, that complex, the Battery Park Place, is, when you see the map of New York City, all those buildings are, or, you know, the map or the television camera shots or any of the visual material that comes, I mean, they're right there. It's amazing that those buildings didn't get
well, and he talks about how 4
well.
months after September 11, 2001, the waterfront esplanade was obstructed by slow-moving rescue and recovery vehicles and by wooden barricades carrying temporary power lines. I mean, there's just this aftermath.
Yeah.
The Winter Garden Mall was severely damaged by the collapse, as were the World Trade Towers, as were office buildings of the World Financial Center. Many windows are still boarded up on the tower to the left. You know, and we forget about that. We've moved on. And then there's that whole issue of how do you live in that area that's been, you know. And what happened is that people started using the social connections that they had and trying to deal with that. It says the Battery Park City residents were less reliant on the social contributions the community could make to the well-being. The residents had less need for neighbors to perform child care because they could pay for other child, you know, for caretakers. But what was interesting, he said residents didn't just describe the communities in terms of space, they defined it through space and the central importance that it had to history. So, you know, this whole importance of what had happened started helping them make sense of what had happened. And I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of recovery of an area, because, and then he also talked about defending real privilege with a display of false charity. You know, that even though the people lived there had privileges, that didn't help when the disaster happened, you know, whatever privilege that they had had. So I thought this was kind of a healthy antidote to the whole thing of, as he says, definitely being in my backyard. You know?
Yeah.
And you think about,
Right.
there's been many other people that have had disasters recently happening. You know, in California we've had mudslides where houses have disappeared down a mountain. And it's one thing to look on it in television. It's something else if it actually is in your backyard.
Well, it also transforms you, doesn't it, into you can't sort of be withdrawn from the world, content with your own sort of social standing. You're suddenly thrust into a totally different world where contact with other people and sort of looking at your own situation is suddenly thrust upon you.
Well, what
Can't
was
deny it.
interesting, they also talked about Ada Louise Huxtable, and what she suggested is the Trade Center towers, this is back in 1966,
Mm-hmm.
could be the start of a new skyscraper age or the biggest tombstones in the world.
Oh, wow.
And so, in a way, this
Yeah.
also represents the limits of technology. We've always thought of them, you know, the biggest, most boldest technology is, you know, it's going
Yeah.
to save our civilization. And it can turn around, like I said, in the 20th century was not only an important historical landmark, both globally and nationally, but also transition period.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they're talking about the skyscrapers in a way represented the oversized ambition of global capitalism. These big, enormous
Oh,
buildings.
enormous. I mean, the World Trade Center, building two of them at the same time, they were the biggest for
Well,
several
I think the
years.
one they're
and-
building in its place, they're trying to make it the tallest in the world, and they're competing with places like Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which is going to be twice the height at which the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
What are we
There's
doing?
one in Malaysia. There's a double spire in Malaysia. I think Shanghai may be building one. Of course, there's the building in Chicago, the Sears Tower, what was called the Sears Tower. It's actually, somebody else bought it. I think it's, I forget the name of the person. It begins with a W, like the Weston or something. An insurance group bought it.
Well, it's interesting also who got involved with all this, because Jane Jacobs, who is known for her concern about city and neighborhoods, got involved with it, and other advocates of new urbanism sought to reshape community by redesign its physical form to replicate older, smaller towns. So what was interesting is here you had these two huge constructions, and yet the thing that's helping the people heal are smaller structures and communities.
Yeah.
In fact, they said he met toward the conclusion of his project, he met a wealthy retiree who lived in a gated community on a small island far from New York. She inquired about my project and then asked me politely if Battery Park City wasn't a positive development, that it had found a way to make a good community, one she might like to visit, in contrast to the horror stories about New York she had gleaned over many years of media coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that aspect of it. You know,
Well, there are a number of, what's the word, a spate of books coming out with the September 12th theme this year because of the 10-year anniversary. And I think the idea is that, first of all, you know, permanent change happened in an instant. I mean, you can never go back again to what was there. And communities, it really makes you look at a number of aspects of, you know, what your community is, who you are in the world community, what have been the repercussions, you know, after September 12th.
well, one of the things he talks about is, okay, so something's been destroyed and you want to rebuild. What do you do?
What do you rebuild, right?
You know, and they talked about that famous Vietnam vet memorial that Lynn did.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, there's been a huge discussion about what's an appropriate response for Ground Zero.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and along with that, they feel what would be an appropriate response for their area. Should they just have an oversized urban redevelopment project take place? And So there's and then he said that the public input contributes directly to a lively public space because political processes communicate the otherwise unknowable needs of diverse groups. So it like exposed a real dialogue, a real conversation, a discourse about what's an appropriate use
Yeah.
of their space and how did they want to live as a community. And what I thought was interesting, even the issue about pipes and conduits, because you're talking the density of the population is so intense. How do you do that? How do you replicate that? He said any major redevelopment project digs through ground that's thick with conduits of people's lives and public space. I think that's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but I've talked with people that in New York, when they start digging for utilities,
Yeah.
they never know what's there.
Layer upon layer of stuff.
There's
right?
no blueprints to encompass all the work that's been done.
Right.
there.
There's no. There, even though there's a misdig. Excuse me. There's misdig. There's history before misdig. To try to track down what the lines are there.
So
Well, I'm in the book. The book goes into some developments of community activism now that's been happening, and trying to sort of reassess. I guess in some ways they have the opportunity to redevelop an urban neighborhood or to develop an urban neighborhood. I don't know about the sort of the class and the economic level. I mean, that was a pretty ritzy place. But you were there among buildings that were devoted purely to commerce. Now, especially with this, well, they're building a remonument, you know, on ground zero right now. I mean, they are building it, but you know, I wonder what's going to happen if there's going to be some kind of softening of the need to have all financial organizations and buildings just commercial buildings. It seems like on one level that event sort of prompted a real re-examination of what community means.
Well, and there's kind of a quirky side effect to this for Battery Park because it was a privileged community. But if they did a project that only would benefit, you know, if they did large-scale planning to only benefit that particular economic, then that doesn't seem fair either.
Yeah, no,
You know,
it's
and
like
so
you want to
it gradually
maybe change the fabric a little bit.
Yeah. Said because the designs reciprocally reinforce exclusivity among subsequent generations of residents. And here they have this chance to really maybe rebuild it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that existed accidentally could be rebuilt. But, well, thanks for being on Rip Rant.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We got through a few this time, four books and plenty more there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.